Hey, Shane Smith here on Mind Matters, the Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions. I'm here with Thomas. He's one of the attorneys in the concussion and brain injury group at Shane Smith Law. Today we're going to talk a little bit about, we're always talking about brain injuries, but today we're going to talk specifically about one of the repercussions of some brain injuries you can have. And what is that today, Thomas? Epilepsy?
Epilepsy and seizures. That's one of the cascade effects that can be caused by a traumatic brain injury. That sets off a cascade of events within the brain, disrupting its normal functioning. One of the significant concerns that you have is the potential development of seizures and epilepsy.
And I know, to me, tons of things that happen from brain injury are scary, but most of those are scary to the person, experiencing the forgetfulness, most of it's felt by that one individual. And it's hard for me just to look at you and know, hey, this is what's going on. But epilepsy and seizures, I feel like have a disruptive effect, even more so than everything else on the family, because everybody can see it.
Right.
And I knew somebody who had epilepsy when I was a child, and they were terribly embarrassed. Anytime they had epilepsy, they were mortified and embarrassed that other people saw it and all of those things. I'm gonna guess it's the same, and if not worse, for our brain injury people.
Yeah, and when we talk about seizures post-brain injury, we're not only referring to those immediate post-traumatic seizures, but also the potential for epilepsy to develop over time. Now, when you have a traumatic brain injury and the disruption of that normal brain activity, that can lead to abnormal electrical discharges within your brain that trigger seizures. Epilepsy is essentially two or more uncontrolled seizures.
I guess you said two or more, so one's not epilepsy. But if you have two or three, is it automatically determined to be epilepsy?
Epilepsy is essentially, two or more uncontrolled seizures. So if you have that first one, no, it's not epilepsy. That can happen, but if you have two or more, and they're uncontrollable, I don't know that's ever controllable.
I was gonna say, what's controllable mean for a seizure? Is it like medication? So you have one and I put you on this medicine and you don't have it again? Is that sort of the controllable aspect of a seizure?
Yeah, that is definitely part of it.
Everybody says abnormal electrical charges, but it's really just the brain misfiring, right?
In a way, yeah. And one of the most important things in figuring this out is diagnosing a seizure. There's a lot of different types of seizures that can happen, or ways that they manifest themselves. And getting the diagnosis right when you have that abnormal electrical discharge, that's really crucial.
How do they diagnose it?
Yeah.
What is that?
It's a great question. There's several things that are very important to it. Of course, you have imaging studies like a CT scan or an MRI. Those will play a crucial kind of high-level role in understanding the extent of the injury and identifying potential areas of concern. But of course, those are high levels, so they don't often get down to a more micro level that you need. Really, with incidents like these, eyewitness accounts are invaluable, and they're crucial in corroborating the occurrence of seizures.
So I would think the odds of you having a seizure while you're in the CT scan or the MRI are pretty minimal.
Pretty minimal, yes.
It have to be just freak, timing kind of deal. So most of it is, the CT or MRI may show some damage to the brain or some issues, but most of it's eyewitness, right? People who saw you have this activity.
Yeah, and a lot of, there are kind of some what you call kind of triggers or warning signs that a person might experience when they're about to have a seizure. Some of those include having a unusual or disagreeable odor that they sense, or even having a deja vu experience.
But the disagreeable odor, there's no real smell there, right? They don't begin to smell. They just, something's triggered, so they smell some weird thing.
Yeah, and it's called an aura, and what that's caused by is a seizure starting in a localized part of your brain. So it's starting a particular segment of your brain, one that might control smell or might control, memory. The seizure starting there, and a person's actual physical appearance and how those symptoms manifest in terms of what someone's looking at can give you clues as to the location of the electrically abnormal part of the brain.
Really? So if I had all the training and were a doctor and all that, and I see you having a seizure, I might be like, oh, he's got a brain injury at this one part of his brain just by your behavior?
Yeah.
Is that specific?
And oftentimes eyewitness accounts get discounted by, defense attorneys or adjusters, but what a doctor is going to do is they're going to talk to family members, they're going to talk to people who were present on the scene. They're going to say, well, when the seizure started, what did you see on the person? Well, I saw his right arm jerking and the right side of his face twitching. that would tell them more than likely that the seizure focus is in the motor strip of the left frontal lobe of the brain. Now, if you're having a seizure focus in that left frontal lobe of your brain and it's confined to that area, you might not have a loss of consciousness, but most of the time, when you have that abnormal electrical activity, it spreads from one particular area of your brain, one particular focus, to the entire brain.
Really? Okay, so you got like a virus almost, right? It's in one spot, all throughout, like, or a lightning, I don't know the right word, but like a lightning storm, or even if I drop food coloring in a pot of water, right, it hits, that's where the seizure starts, and then it spreads throughout as far as it can go?
Yeah, it's like, there's the famous saying, I don't know who said it, it's when you drop a pebble into a pond, even after the pebble has hit the bottom of the pond, the water still trembles.
Yeah.
Same thing applies with your brain. And, when you have it spread to the rest of your brain, that seizure is quickly followed by a loss of consciousness and convulsive activity on both sides of your body. So this changes from being, seizure focus in one area to what we call focal seizure with secondary generalization. Now,
we talked a little bit about seizures. What is a seizure, right? Because to me, the seizure, the only image I have is the person who falls down on the ground and convulses that I used to see when I was a child, basically. But there are other types of seizures as well you can run into, right?
Yeah, there are different types of seizures. One of those would be the focal seizure with the impairment of consciousness. This is where you might see, you're not always going to see a loss of consciousness with a seizure. You might see an altered state of consciousness where you see someone who's awake, but unresponsive, and they might just be staring or doing automatic repetitive movements like smacking their lips or picking at their clothing.
But they're not really there.
Right, they're in an altered state of consciousness. That's what you would call it used to be called a petit mal or a complex partial seizure, but that's what kind of referred to a second ago. It's called the focal seizure with the impairment of consciousness. Now, there are other types aside from that one as well.
I mean, how long do these things normally last? Are they all a few brief seconds, or can they last minutes?
So it depends on your type. And so, for example, with generalized seizures, these occur with sudden onset over the entire brain at once without a warning, and they come in different types. When you have these generalized seizures, you can have a tonic-clonic seizure. With this type, there's no warning, no aura, but there's a sudden loss of consciousness with multiple rhythmic, convulsive jerks of the arms and outward stiffening of the legs. These will last anywhere usually from 30 to 120 seconds, so 30 seconds to 2 minutes. It's often accompanied by frothing at the mouth or losing control of your bladder or bowels and tongue biting. So like you said, talk about embarrassment. I had a friend at our church, another young person at our church, that would happen, and it was always terribly embarrassing. It didn't happen every time, but when it did, it's there was going to be a lot of embarrassment associated.
Right, yeah.
with it. And then with that tonic-clonic seizure that we talked about, it's usually after you have that loss of control of the bladders, frothing at the mouth, the tongue biting, you have to roll the person on their side. The person's unresponsive, and there's typically a snoring type breathing for another 15 to 20 minutes.
Oh wow, so it's definitely not quick.
And that's called the post-tictal state. And so that's just kind of, that's the medical term for that afterwards.
And I know people who've had this, and basically, you could say, well, you're only having seizures, but when you have these major seizures, all the embarrassment, that makes them almost afraid to leave the house, because they're afraid to embarrass in front of church or friends or everybody, right? It just becomes this closeted, devastating impact, right?
Yeah, there's several other downstream effects. You think about depression, you think about, loss of friendships, just like you said, just being totally embarrassed. It can even go beyond this in terms of different types of seizures. You got what you call recurrence. When you have recurrent seizures, one after the other, when you're not gaining consciousness, this is really scary. It's called status epilepticus.
Okay.
And this is a medical emergency, and that must be treated immediately, or permanent brain damage can result. And the other particularly scary thing about this is in the traumatic brain injury context, this is something that children are much more likely to develop. So if you think about how terrifying that is, seeing your young daughter or son having a traumatic brain injury and saying, hey, this is a subset of the population that's more likely to be at risk for status elliptical. happens.
And this is sort of the seizure that never ends until medicine comes into play. Is that?
Yeah, it's they are just it almost, you want to say, being hit by wave after wave of this.
Wow. And that's got to be devastating for the person, devastating for the family member. You probably just assumed they were dying.
Yeah,
and they can die.
Right.
Without the right medical care,
will never be the same.
And think about how you're waiting for an ambulance to get there, right?
Yeah, and you think in those periods, you think about brain damage and how quickly it can happen. It's the seconds matter, minutes matter. Loss of brain function. You might not die, but you might not ever be. You might be a shell of who you were before, or never realize who you were going to be if you're a kid. So yeah, the description of the seizure, and eyewitness accounts that they give at the time of the seizure, that's important in that seizure diagnosis.
And I never would have thought, okay, pay super attention if you were to see somebody to everything that's going on, how it started, because that's the key. If they didn't know and they don't have that diagnosis where the injury is, that's a huge key, right, for everybody. It tells the doctors where to start looking.
Right, because you have diagnostic tools, right? We talked about CAT scans, or CT scans, we talked about MRIs. There's EEGs, but here's the really interesting thing about that. They can help determine the nature of the seizure if you talk about an EEG, but about 10% of patients with known epilepsy never in their lives have an abnormal EEG between seizures.
Wow.
And it's not, you're not ever really going to be able to catch someone with an EEG when they have a seizure.
Right, when they have it, like we say, you'd have to just be sitting in the doctor's office and have crazy timing.
Yeah, and then 50% of patients with a first seizure who subsequently develop epilepsy, they have a normal initial EEG.
So they thought they were okay, they had the brain injury, thought they were okay, and then bam, that hits.
Nothing about the diagnostic tools that told them that this was going to be something that they're at risk for. And it's, again, the eyewitness accounts that really tell us.
So we'll flip to the legal side now. So the fact that somebody had a negative EEG or a normal EEG is helpful, but it's certainly not persuasive if 50% of them don't have it or have a normal one until something happens, until they don't, basically, right?
Yeah, it's almost searching for a needle in the haystack if you're trying to find this on an EEG.
I think it's important to note, Thomas, that this is sort of a deeper topic. We're going to do 2 podcast episodes on this. Now, in this one, we talked a lot about triggers and what happened and what epilepsy was and all this. In our next episode, we're going to talk about the treatment and how they treat car accident or brain injury types of epilepsy, which is very similar to regular epilepsy. We'll be covering that in next week's episode. So for all of our listeners out there, if you've enjoyed this topic or find it interesting, if you like and subscribe so you can see our newest episodes. If you hit the bell, you'll see the notification when the new episodes come out. And if you have a brain injury or questions or concerns about this issue, or were in an accident and suffer this and would like to talk to one of our attorneys in the concussion and brain injury group, just give us a call at 980-999-9999. And remember, if you're in pain, call Shane or go to our website. We've got tons of information there as well. Thanks.
In pain, so I call Shane. 980-999-9999. In pain, call Shane.